Hayes, I would like to turn your attention to July the 20th, 2011. You recall that that's the night that you went out in the boat with Grant Hayes and disposed of Laura Ackerson's remains.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
And it was almost a full moon that night, wasn't it?
I believe so. There were lots of trees everywhere.
Okay. But you went and got into the boat, and you have testified here before this jury that you paddled out into the middle of that creek. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
And then did you continue to paddle, or did you yourself start taking pieces of Laura Ackerson and throwing them into the water?
Ma'am, I never saw anything.
Okay, how big was that boat, ma'am?
I believe everyone witnessed it. I don't know for sure what the measurements of it are.
Okay. You were in the boat.
That's correct. I was at the back of the boat.
Who else was in the boat?
Grant Hayes?
Okay. And were there any coolers in the boat?
No, ma'am, not at all.
What could you see in the boat?
Whenever I got in the boat, I just saw black plastic.
Okay. And then there were 2 oars in that boat. Did you use both of the oars or just one?
Just one.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
And so you were paddling. How long did it take you to paddle over to the middle of the creek?
I don't recollect a time frame.
You said when you first got out that you and Grant wanted to go one way, but the boat started going the other way. Is that right?
I said whenever we pushed the boat was facing going toward the right, but we wanted to go toward the left. So instead of trying to turn around, we just rode the boat backwards. The boat kept rocking, and I kept telling Grant to be still. He was going to flip the boat over.
This was about what time at night?
I don't recall exactly. It was dark.
And when you got out to the left, because you couldn't turn the boat around,
Yes, ma'am.
what did you do?
I just paddled, and the boat was filling up with water, and so I started bailing the water out of the boat. While we were trying, I was paddling with one oar and bailing the water out at the same time.
What were you doing out in the boat that night? What was your plan?
I didn't have a plan. I was just doing whatever he told me to do.
And when you started bailing out the water from the boat, what was Grant Hayes doing?
I honestly don't know. He was behind me and I didn't see him. I was just trying to keep the boat in the center, not going into the grassy areas. I heard animals all around me, and that was my primary focus, was to keep the boat from sinking, being flipped over, and keeping it away from the grassy areas.
When you testified, when you talked on direct, when you testified before this jury earlier today, you said it took a really, really long time.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
It seemed like it took forever. Yes, ma'am, it sure did.
And it took forever for you to paddle and keep the boat from going into the grass area?
Yes, ma'am. Just the whole experience of being on the boat, that's correct.
Ms. Hayes, isn't it true that when you were out in the boat, that you were taking Laura Ackerson's remains and throwing them?
Ma'am, I never saw
aside?
anything.
Wait till the end of my question, please, ma'am. Isn't it true that you were taking Laura Ackerson's remains, which included her torso and her head and parts of her leg, and throwing them over the side of the boat?
Again, I never saw anything that was going on behind me.
You indicated that you were in the back of the boat, but you couldn't see what was going on behind you?
I was facing toward the water. That's correct.
Well, what could you hear? What could you smell?
I was listening. I heard the animals, and honestly, I didn't smell anything.
You didn't smell anything?
No, ma'am.
Do you recall making a statement on a prior occasion that you were, it smelled so bad that it was making your stomach roil?
No, ma'am, I don't recall that.
Now, before you went out in the boat that night, you had already dumped the acid at that point, is that right?
Yes, ma'am. Or no, ma'am, that the next morning is when that happened.
Okay. So you'd purchased or been involved in the purchase of the acid, but you hadn't dumped it yet.
I was not involved in the purchase. I just drove him there.
And before you went out in the boat that night, you asked your sister for some clothing, is that right?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
Did you ask her for a pair of shoes as well?
Not until the next day.
And that was because the shoes that you had worn out on the boat, along with the clothing that you had worn out on the boat, you had driven Grant Hayes, and y'all had gone to an apartment complex and dumped that in a dumpster. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. I drove him and he dumped it. Yes, that's correct.
You had testified earlier about that Monday night that Shelton came home, that you started talking with him about his business. You talked with him about wild pigs.
Yes, ma'am.
You talked with him about whether or not they would eat human remains.
Yes, ma'am, I did.
You talked with him about alligators.
Yes, ma'am.
You talked to him about whether or not alligators would eat human remains.
I don't remember exactly the entire conversation, but yes, to generalize, yes, I was asking him different questions. Had just found out, and he was my first source, and I was just asking him because I figured if anyone knew, that he would at this point.
Okay, so let me get this straight. You had just found out, according to your testimony,
Yes, ma'am.
that Laura Ackerson was with you there in Texas and that you needed to dispose of her body.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
And your response to that was to wait until your nephew got there and ask him if wild pigs ate human remains, if alligators ate human remains. What did he tell you? Did he tell you whether or not wild pigs would eat human remains?
Yes, ma'am, he did say that pigs would eat anything. Yes, ma'am, he did.
Did he tell you that alligators would eat human remains?
I don't really recall what he said about the alligators, honestly. I know that my sister had told me before that that they did go alligator hunting, and I don't really recall. But she said that they had gone over in that area.
When you say in that area, you meant across the street.
Correct, yes,
You asked
ma'am.
him if there were alligators across the street.
I already knew there were alligators because my sister had told me many stories about the boys, and they've lived there for many years, so.
You knew there were alligators in that area before you got in the Dodge Durango and traveled across the country to your sister's house in Texas, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am, but that was not at all why I was going to my sister's.
And so on this occasion, on Monday night, the 18th of July of 2011, you asked your nephew Shelton, as soon as he comes home, about the pigs and about the alligators. Did you question him about alligator hunting?
I really don't recall.
Do you recall asking him where in the creek across the way the alligators were?
I know that he had said something that they don't usually come right there because of the people. So he had told me that they were way far into the creek. My two nephews, they go in that creek all the time. I had never ever been to that creek ever in my entire life before the 20th of July.
So this was the source of information that you had about that creek and alligator hunting, and whether or not there were alligators in that creek.
Yes, just from my nephews and my sister. That's
And
correct.
what time are you having this conversation with your nephew Shelton?
It's in the middle of the night, probably about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning.
Okay. And he told you, in fact, that the alligators in that creek really didn't stay close to that area, that you had to go further down where there wasn't so much development. Is that right?
He just said further down. He didn't really say how far down. He just said because of the people, they didn't come in that area.
And do you recall asking him about that creek and the spillway and exactly if that creek crossed back over the road or under the road further down?
I don't recall asking him that. Grant may have asked him, but I don't recall.
And on that Monday night, when you spoke with Shelton, did you ask him anything about acid, or was it all about
No.
pigs and alligators?
I just asked him because that was the type of work he was in, and that's the only thing I asked him. I wasn't trying to involve him. I was just trying to obtain some information.
You were trying to get the information from him so that you wouldn't have to involve him in disposing of Laura Ackerson.
I did not want to involve anybody in anything. I was very, very upset that I had been put in this position.
When, now you knew at this location at Skinner Lane that there was a hog pen that was located there at Skinner Lane.
I didn't know until my sister pointed it out and identified what it was.
Well, you had gotten there on the morning of Monday the 18th, is that right?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
And your testimony before this jury is that on the morning of the 19th, that you told your sister, or that you had some discussion with your sister about the fact that Laura was dead.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
And at that time, you told her that you had done it.
That's correct, yes, ma'am.
And you asked for her help to help get rid of Laura's remains.
Yes, ma'am, can I explain?
Sure.
I was doing that because Grant told me to tell her that. It was not my idea to tell her. It was his idea for me to tell her and what to tell her because he felt like that was the only way she was going to help us. And at that point, that was the only solution he had.
And did she help you?
Very basically.
Okay. And she helped you by, at that point, showing you the hog pen?
She helped by keeping the children safe.
Okay. Well, I want to talk with you and understand, Ms. Hayes, about when you tell your sister that Laura Ackerson is dead, that you've done it, and that you want help disposing of her body. I want to understand from that point forward what you did there at her house.
Well, first of all, I didn't ask her with help to dispose the body. I asked her for help for ideas. I was trying to have her to help us with solutions. I wasn't asking her to exactly be involved in it physically.
You were asking her for ideas about how to dispose of Laura's body?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did you ask her?
Basically what you've heard here already.
No, what did you ask her?
I needed help.
Okay. Did you ask her, how do we get rid of a body?
I don't remember exactly the terminology, but basically that's the general.
And what did she tell you?
She came up with a few ideas, and
What were her ideas of how to get rid of
she
Laura's
is
body?
the one that suggested the septic system in the back. She pointed out the hog pen. Grant had asked her questions about the well, and he ultimately had the idea about the acid. And later that afternoon, he came up with the idea about the boat.
So the three of you eventually are sitting there talking about ideas about how to get rid of Laura's body.
That's correct.
And your sister, who you've described as being like a mother to you,
Yes, ma'am.
suggests to you throwing her body in the septic tank?
She just pointed out that there was a septic system there. She didn't go into detail what to do with it. She just pointed out that it was there.
So the question was, how can we get rid of this body? And she points to a septic tank.
She says that there is a septic system in the back.
Well, and you actually walk with her over to the septic tank, don't you?
That's correct, with her and Grant.
Do you look into the septic tank?
No, ma'am. There is a bunch of boards and concrete and all kinds of debris and stuff on top of it. It would have been impossible to even, it was not even plausible in any form.
That wasn't going to work out, throwing her in the septic tank.
Definitely not.
The hog pen? Whose idea was it to go to the hog pen?
It was just something that she pointed out.
Okay, and again, tell me how that happens. When you say, we want to get rid of this body, how do we do it? How do you end up at the hog pen?
I honestly don't have an answer for that question. I was just following them. We were all just kind of brainstorming. I don't think there was very much rational thinking at this point at all from anybody.
What I'm trying to understand, Ms. Hayes, and to ask you about is, you've indicated you go to your sister and say, I have brought the body of the mother of these two boys that I brought to your house. I need help in disposing of this body. And y'all begin a brainstorming session to come up with solutions and ideas.
Well, first of all, I did not intentionally take a dead body to my sister's house. It was a position that I was put in involuntarily, totally against my will. I would have never, ever, ever, ever in a gazillion years done such a thing. Ever.
You would have never taken a body to your sister's house to dispose of.
Never.
But yet, when you were asked to help get rid of the body, your response is to sit down and, first of all, ask your nephew for ideas about alligators and pigs, wild pigs, then to talk to your sister about throwing her into a septic tank, going to a hog pen and doing something.
Honestly, ma'am, I wasn't really asked. I was told. He didn't ask me to help him. He told me I had to help him.
When you were going through this brainstorming session with your sister and with Grant Hayes, at some point you all settled on the idea of acid.
I think that Grant came up with that idea and we just let him go with it. We weren't going to argue, dispute, or participate in any more. When he felt like he came up with a solution,
You weren't going to participate anymore when he came up with the acid solution?
whenever he came up with an idea of what he wanted to do.
Okay, and what was the acid idea?
Honestly, I don't know 100%.
Okay, what percent do you know?
I just know that he said he needed was going to get some acid. What or how he intended on using it, I don't know. He didn't share that information with me.
And so at the point that you settle on the acid solution, you leave Lily and the two boys with your sister and then drive Grant to the Home Depot to purchase the acid.
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
You knew you were going to purchase acid.
I knew that I was taking him to Home Depot. What he was going to purchase, I am not 100%.
What did you think you were going to purchase at that point?
Well, I knew that he had mentioned acid, but again, I don't know 100% what he did even purchase.
You were part of the discussion with your sister when you asked for directions to the Home Depot.
Correct, yes, ma'am.
You were present when there was discussion about Home Depot being a place that sold acid.
Correct, yes, ma'am.
And so after you had that discussion, you borrow your nephew's truck and drive Grant to the Home Depot.
Correct.
Were you still in the truck when he came out and unloaded the acid and put it in the truck?
He put it in the back of the truck, and I was in the front of the truck. That's correct.
Oh, so again, this was to your back. You
Yes,
couldn't
ma'am.
see that?
That's correct.
And when did you realize there was acid in the truck?
Whenever he asked me to get rid of it the next day.
How much money did you give him before he went into the Home Depot?
I don't recall. Whatever I got from the ATM, whatever that was.
But you didn't go into the Home Depot, you sat out in the truck.
Yes, ma'am, I did.
What time of day was this when you were sitting
It
out in
was
the truck?
it was early.
10 or so in the morning?
That sounds about right.
How long did you sit out in the truck?
I really don't recall. Long enough for him to go in, come out, ask me to make the phone call, for him to go back in, make his purchases, and come back out.
Well, the video that we've seen showed 30 minutes on that second entry. Does that make sense to you, that it was at least 30 minutes on that second time?
That sounds about right. He wasn't in there very long the first time.
And during that time, were there people coming and going at the Home Depot?
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, it was open for business,
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
pretty full parking lot.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
And before that, when you went over to the ATM, there were other people using the ATM and in the area?
Honestly, I was in such my own little, honestly, I wasn't paying attention to the world around me. I was encaged in my own, just trying to get what he needed me to get, and I wasn't paying attention to the outside world.
When you left the Home Depot, did you drive him back to your aunt's house? I'm sorry, your sister's house?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.